Unlike the last of a species unique to nature in its creation and circumstance, what the last battleship is fairly arbitrary in both how someone can see last and battleship. This piece of wood in my sink is the last battleship because none of the others say battleship on the side of them, do they? I'd like to go off the deep end a bit here and try to contextualize this. The Kirov class Peter Veliki would be the last laid down, launched, commissioned, and in service, but only if you consider her and her sisters to be battle cruisers and consider that sort of battle cruiser to be a form of battleship. I don't, so I'm going to ignore them and hope they go away, which given the history of the class and the Russian Navy might actually be successful. 9 mostly intact battleships still exist today as museums, so let's go over those and what their provenance might be for being the last battleship. Someone might be screaming about Georgia Savaroth being a 10th, but no, as cool as she is, that's a cruiser. The only one outside of the US is the Mikasa, and she hasn't been afloat since the 1920s, so she's been more of a battle structure since then. She is notably the last pre-dreadnought, but that's not what we're going for here. USS Texas, USS Massachusetts, USS North Carolina, and USS Alabama are in an awkward middle ground with essentially no consideration for either age, time of service, or anything else here, so let's move on to the Iowas. USS Missouri was the last to be commissioned in June 1944, but in terms of the last recommissioning of a battleship, that would be USS Wisconsin in October 1988. The last of the existing Iowas to be laid down was also USS Wisconsin, but the last launched was the Missouri in January 1944. USS Missouri also has the distinction of being the last Iowa to be decommissioned for the first time in 1955, as well as the last battleship to be decommissioned in March 1992. Finally, to stop talking about the Iowas, the last 2 to be stricken from the U.S. Navy Register were USS Iowa and USS Wisconsin in March 2006. I actually lied because Congress decided to be weird about things when this happened, and the Navy ended up paying for the Wisconsin to be in a state of theoretically being able to be activated for combat until 2009. This included maintaining shells, powder, and barrels, as well as not allowing her to be modified in a way that might impair her military capability, like how USS New Jersey's turret locking pins were welded in place. Those were just the currently existing battleships. Let's go over some that don't exist anymore. A quick note, I don't think it's useful to consider the Alaskas to be battleships or battlecruisers, so I won't be talking about them. The 3 ships under consideration here are the sisters Richelieu and Jean Bart, as well as HMS Vanguard. HMS Vanguard was the last of these 3 to be laid down and launched in October 1941 and November 1944 respectively, but the last to be commissioned was Jean Bart in 1949. Jean Bart is very weird because while she was commissioned then and technically completed, her main battery was never fully functional, so the last battleship to be actually finished would be HMS Vanguard in 1946. Richelieu was the last to be decommissioned in 1967, but had really exited service as a battleship in 1957 and never sailed again, but her sister would be the last to be struck from the Naval Register on February 10, 1970. A warship is designed for war, not just cruising around, so what are the last milestones in terms of combat for these ships? USS Mississippi fired the last salvo against another battleship at Surigao Strait in 1944. Jean Bart was the last continuously serving battleship to fire in anger during the Suez Crisis in 1956. USS Wisconsin was the last battleship to fire her main guns in anger in February 1991 during the Gulf War. Some of the Iowas fired their main guns after Desert Storm for training purposes, but I don't have enough information to say for sure which was the last to do this. The last weird thing here to bring up are the 2 incomplete Iowa class, battleships that never really existed. USS Illinois was the final battleship to be laid down in December 1942, and USS Kentucky could be considered to have been launched in 1950, but not really since that was just to get the dry dock she was in freed up. Neither were completed, but they deserve a bit of a mention here, and for some reason show up in Neon Genesis Evangelion. To return from the deep end, let me untangle a bunch of those threads and get rid of some of the qualifiers that overlap between how I grouped the ships earlier. This goes chronologically with a few other things thrown in. Last to be laid down and completed, HMS Vanguard, October 2nd, 1941. Last to be laid down, USS Illinois, December 6, 1942. Last to fire at another battleship, USS Mississippi, October 25, 1944. Last to be launched, HMS Vanguard, November 30th, 1944. Bonus, last commissioned pre-dreadnought, SMS Schließen, May 9th, 1945. I wasn't sure if I should say last decommissioned pre-dreadnought, as she was sunk by a mine. Last to be fully functional and commissioned for the first time, HMS Vanguard, May 12, 1946. Last to be commissioned for the first time, Jean Bart, January 8, 1949. Bonus, last decommissioned battlecruiser, Yavuz, December 20th, 1950. Last continuously commissioned battleship to fire in wartime, Jean Bart, November 5th, 1956. Last continuously commissioned battleship to be decommissioned, Richelieu, September 30th, 1967. Last battleship to be recommissioned, USS Wisconsin, October 22, 1988. Last battleship to fire main guns in combat, USS Wisconsin, February 28, 1991. Last battleship to be decommissioned, USS Missouri, March 1, 1992. Last battleships to be stricken from a naval register, USS Wisconsin and USS Iowa, March 17, 2006. Last battleship to be required to be reactivated, USS Wisconsin, December 14, 2009. The three most mentioned here are Vanguard, Jean Bart, and Wisconsin, and they're the individual ships I think hold the most merit of being the last battleship. Jean Bart and Vanguard occupy the same sort of slot here, with their claim to be the last based on when they were constructed and commissioned. The argument for Jean Bart doesn't really make any sense when you look behind just the date of her commissioning. While incomplete in 1942, she opposed the Allied landings in Casablanca years before Vanguard even launched. The kicker to this is that she was never that much more functional than when she fought and was disabled by USS Massachusetts. This leaves us with Vanguard and USS Wisconsin. I'm from the United States and a Green Bay Packers fan, so understand that this conclusion comes with great bias, but I'm of the opinion that USS Wisconsin is the last battleship. She fired the last wartime battleship salvo in history over 3 decades after Vanguard was sent to the breakers, while the difference in when they were laid down is less than a year. I'd love to hear what you think, especially if you disagree or notice an error I've made, and I hope you'll subscribe and like the video. Thanks for watching.